Welcome to Frazier Deeter's Culture of Compliance podcast series, where we discuss compliance as a competitive advantage in today's marketplace. I'm Sabrina Serafin, partner and national leader of Frazier Deeter's Process Risk and Governance practice. And today we're going to focus on the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on internal audit by discussing the results of a survey from the Institute of Internal Auditors that was issued in April of 2020. We've brought together a group of Frazier Deeter professionals who focus on internal audit, who will discuss the survey and its results and what it means to us. Let me introduce our participants. First, Jason Sammons is a partner in our Process Risk and Governance practice, and Jason's past experience includes serving as a director of internal audit for a global pharmaceutical company and as the global corporate controller for an industry-leading document management solutions company. Jason also began his career at Ernst & Young. Hello, Jason.
Hi, Sabrina.
We also have Katrina Barrett, a director in Frazier Deeter's Process Risk and Governance practice. And prior to joining Frazier Deeter, Katrina successfully established internal controls functions and executed a year one Sarbanes-Oxley program for a $1.6 billion IPO. Katrina's other previous experience includes leading specialized compliance, internal audit, and internal control engagements, as well as performing comprehensive segregations of duties assessments and providing user access control solutions. Katrina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you today.
Our third guest is Matt Hornfeck, who is a manager in our Process Risk and Governance practice. Prior to joining Frazier Deeter, Matt served as internal audit manager for a large financial services company for several years. And Matt began his career at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he also served as an audit manager. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Sabrina. Great to be here.
As we record this podcast, our firm is 8 weeks into the era of operating remotely as part of the efforts to slow the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. And given the situation, the results of the Institute of Internal Auditors survey seemed like a great topic to discuss on the podcast. Jason, can you give us an overview of the survey that was issued by the IAA?
Sure. Thanks, Sabrina. Like you say, this is a fast-moving topic. Everybody's finding their way almost on a day-by-day basis. But this survey was a benchmark opportunity to get some interesting feedback from leaders across the internal audit community. As you said, it was conducted in about the second week of April 2020. So by that time, most organizations had settled down in terms of what the plan was, started to think about how to navigate the remote working environment and the restrictions that we had. And so it was really interesting to see these results come back. There were about 400 total respondents, a wide industry coverage, and the information provided by the respondents really centered around four main areas. So how the pandemic has impacted audit planning, projections around impact on budgets, risk assessments, as well as overall staffing impacts and department planning and department priorities. So it's clearly not business as usual. And as we see companies gradually shift from survival to looking ahead and what's next, that's going to be an area of focus for all chief audit executives and their teams.
Okay, so let's pause there. Let's talk about budget reductions and the impact to internal audit.
Yeah, so the survey revealed that about a third of organizations have decreased their budgets. For the most part, those decreases have been categorized as slight, and that means the majority of the respondents have either stayed the same or seen very little impact to their budgets. That's not terribly unexpected that there would be some budget reductions. I would anticipate that the majority of that is on discretionary spending, variable spending like travel, and other things that have been canceled in the wake of the immediate shutdown that we've been experiencing. So overall, I would say that the results appear positive in that most organizations are not sharply declining internal audit budgets as an immediate response.
Katrina, you have thoughts?
I do. Similar to the survey comments that related to the budget impacts, there were equally some questions asked of chief audit executives around staffing. And while about a third of the organizations were reporting budget cuts, about a quarter or more were reporting staffing decreases. And the corollary between those then does cause me to want to stay in tune to whether those staffing decreases are short-term furloughs, reductions in outsourcing, or permanent decreases over the long haul. So that's a metric that we would want to keep an eye on as the pandemic and the impacts of it continue.
Matt, what was your perspective on the changed focus for internal audit as a result of this survey?
Right. So for me, in taking away from the survey, there was certainly a significant effect on the focus for internal audit. And it felt like coming away from it that you almost had to, as a chief auditor or audit director, really have to go back and really re-script as far as what you had planned for 2020. A lot of focus being shifted over to the areas that you'd think about in a crisis like this, as far as business continuity and liquidity and cost control. And then with the increased use of technology, all the concerns around cybersecurity and data privacy. And then just to see what was enlightening even further was to see such a large percentage of audit shops being redirected into different areas of the business. I think as we were chatting prior to the call, Katrina had mentioned, this disruption, moving internal audit from the third line of defense into first and second line, which is really interesting. And I know, one thing that poises internal auditors and one thing we always focus on is being nimble and being able to be risk responsive and have that mindset. So, and I think that's really, in all likelihood, helped internal auditors make that shift and make that jump into different areas of the business that they hadn't normally been accustomed to. In fact, I'll be really interested to see and hear some of the stories that come out of this and some of the different initiatives that internal auditors were tasked with during the pandemic.
Matt, that's a very good point because it speaks very highly to the way in which organizations see their internal audit resources and the skills that are within their internal audit teams. Mm-hmm. Because oftentimes, we'd like to think of our internal audit expertise as being very value add and consultative in nature. And for team members across multiple industries and spectrums of organizations to be tapped in such a critical time period to perform vital functions is further evidence to the value of the broad skills that our internal audit team members bring to the table.
Great point, Katrina. Were there any areas not specifically highlighted in the survey that surprised you?
There definitely were. And I really liked, even within the survey, breaking it down within the various industries and really looking at the industry angle of which chief audit executives were expressing concern about the future of their companies, which industries were showing the most impact to either staff or budgets, and really how they were deploying their resources. So there are so many unique nuggets of information within this survey that we could probably talk about it all day. But one in particular that strikes me is the volume of responses that related to their internal audit resources being redirected to either the payroll protection program, the small business loans, the healthcare reimbursements from either FEMA or various other federal components, how internal audit resources were being used to track those costs, the impacts to their organizations, helping to apply for those loans, helping to monitor toward loan forgiveness, all of the various things that essentially grew out of this pandemic that there is not a recipe or a scorecard to necessarily do for the business yet, that are all very emerging activities. And similar to what we were just speaking about, this really shows that how nimble our internal audit expertise can be, and how well internal auditors get to know their business and their organization to be able to pivot so quickly to provide this valued service to their executive teams.
Jason, what is your concern, or do you have concerns around the increased number of opportunities internal audit can assist, but at the same time, managing the risks managing the risks that the organization was already aware of prior to coronavirus? Are they being stretched too thin?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Sabrina. And, a couple of statistics that I'll highlight from the survey here is that 48% of respondents stated that they have canceled audits. That's offset by 39% saying they've added audits. So that sounds like a switch or a redeployment of resources, which is further supported by 38% having redirected staff to some of the areas that Katrina referenced earlier. And so, as you say, the plans that were in place late 2019 to set up for a successful 2020 were risk responsive to the organization's profile of risks at that time. And many of those risks continue to exist. So I think that it's going to be a big challenge for audit leaders to balance the needs of their staff and determine how best to select the priorities. And so internal audit leaders are going to have to make some tough decisions about how they deploy their resources going forward.
Well, Jason, to your point there, with so many chief audit executives across a variety of industries reporting that their internal audit staff was being redirected to non-audit work, and so many canceled or reduced scope audits, it really leads me to think through how the lines of defense that we traditionally think of within internal audit are starting to collapse or blur a bit during this crisis situation. There are increased opportunities both for the internal audit department to provide staff augmentation type services, which is a great thing for those resources. But when it comes time to then monitor or evaluate the effectiveness of those various activities, there are less internal audit resources able to provide that more independent view of the organization. And so in my mind, I do think that we want to make sure that maintaining the effectiveness and the oversight is not lost in the initial response of everyone being willing to roll up their sleeves and contribute wherever possible.
The IAA has provided us with some very valuable information that brought to light a number of aspects that many people were not thinking about 2 months ago. If there was one piece of information from the survey that you would want to make sure people were calling attention to, what might that be? And Katrina, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Sabrina. I think, to me, the most interesting piece of this survey were the free-form answers that were in the appendices. There were so many interesting bits of information to pull out from there that really spoke to my focus on, for example, segregation of duties. While the obvious reaction to the remote work and the COVID experience on these businesses is related to cybersecurity and BCP and things of that nature, those responses and the nature of them really shifted my attention toward what the impacts of staff augmentation are. And while people are being furloughed, workforces in and out of internal audit are being potentially impacted by reduced numbers, then that shifts the ability to have proper segregation of duties within the workplace and within the controls that were already a natural part of the business prior to the pandemic. So the blend of the staff augmentation, but yet the extra need for expertise that has really close familiarity with the business dovetail together at a point for me that I would be paying particular attention to those higher level review controls within the control framework so that things like that don't slip at a time when they're needed the most.
Good advice. Matt, I'm going to turn to you and ask you what was your main takeaway from the survey?
One other thing just to think about, it's really forcing us as auditors to be a little bit more creative in how we approach our audit procedures and developing and adopting some more, I guess you could say, advanced or newer techniques as far as how we gather evidence. Maybe there's going to be, it sounds like from the survey that there's going to be an increase in or focus on data analytics, all things that we've been talking about and been emphasizing over the past years. And now you kind of see it come to light in a crisis like this of, all right, let's step in and go ahead and push forward with all this. So I think those are the main things just at a high level for me, and taking away is some of those fundamentals of being an internal auditor shifting and changing. And we're seeing the internal auditor step up to the challenge.
Yes, creativity. That's a great word to describe what we're faced with right now. Jason?
Yeah, I think I'd just come back to this idea of change, and the survey telling us across all industries, across all respondents, that 75% are making updates to their audit plan. So as the conversation turns to what's next, I think the advice I'd probably give to audit leaders and the challenge that's in front of all of us is to really plugging into what's happening in the boardroom, the decisions that audit committees and executive management teams are taking, and how to position internal audit functions to respond timely and properly to those emerging risks.
Well, Jason, Katrina, and Matt, I want to thank you all for being our guests today on the podcast. Very interesting conversation. And to our audience, thank you for listening to Frazier Deeter's Culture of Compliance podcast. And please join us for our next episode as we continue to discuss transforming compliance requirements into investments in your business.
Thanks for listening to one of Frazier & Deeter's branded podcasts. To learn more, connect with us on LinkedIn or visit us at FrazierDeeter.com, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode.